thanks for being here. I'm glad you found the room. It's quite a walk to get back here. I'm the moderator. Everybody will have 20 minutes and we'll just go in the order that's on the program. So I'll turn it over. People on Zoom, I assume we're okay. If not, let me know. G, you ready?
So hello everyone, thanks for coming to my presentation. My name is Qi Jiang, a first year PhD student from the Ohio State University. Today I'm going to talk about recent work, learning and fatigue in real discrete choice experiment. And this is work collaborating with Jeremy, an assistant professor from Louisiana State University, and Wu Yang, who is a professor from the Ohio State University. So yeah, here is a brief outline of my today's presentation. So first, let me introduce you a little bit about background about this research, like why I came up with this idea and why it's important to study this issue. So discrete choice experiment has been widely applied to estimate the economic value for both market or non-market goods for years. Typical DCAE is each respondent is usually given multiple choice set to answer in order to increase the sample efficiency. A key assumption to ensure the validity of this repeated framework is that respondents hold a consistent preference. So you may wonder, what is the consistent preference? So based on my understanding, I think it is that respondents make choices only based on the information provided in that choice set. So in other words, no matter how the other factors change, like order of presenting the choice sets or the choice that they have seen previously, as long as the content of that choice that remain unchanged, their choices should be remain unchanged. And however, we know that there's like existing ordering effects may challenge this assumption. And some of the scholars found that the respondent may behave differently as the choice test progresses. And maybe they are more likely to select the opt-out option in the later sequence of the choice set. And the ordering effects may take many forms, and the learning fatigue could be the main two types. And you know, what is learning? So preference, I think this can be formed by the experience of making the choices, or the practice, or the repetition. And in a discrete choice experiment environment, the respondent may utilize the first couple of the choices to learn, and their choice may become stable gradually in the later sequence of the choice. And you wonder why could this happen? In my opinion, I think it's because most of the respondents have no experience in making choices in a discrete choice environment. And oftentimes the goods or services evaluation are non-market goods. So overall, they have no experience in such an unfamiliar environment, and they have no experience of those goods or service evaluation. So that's why they need to learn. And for the fatigue, you can imagine that when people are doing something repeatedly over and over again, and the cognitive burden accumulates, and it may hit the threshold that they can tolerate. So at that point, the respondent will become distracted, and they start to adopt a simpler decision rule, like they may ignore some of the attributes, or they may ignore some of the alternatives, and they may always choose the same option, like the opt-out option, and they even make some random choices. So yeah, you can imagine that when they are answering too many choice sets, or the choice that they're answering are too complicated for them, the fatigue may happen. However, we found that the current empirical work regarding this learning and fatigue are all based on the hypothetical discrete choice experiments. Yeah, so we know that people may behave differently in hypothetical and real discrete choice experiment shown by the previous work regarding the hypothetical bias. So we are also kind of curious, what does those learning and fatigue look like in real discrete choice experiment? And also we know that the learning fatigue may stem from like three possible mechanisms. The first one is that respondent might have formed consistent preference, but they choose not to reveal it. This is kind of similar to the hypothetical bias case. People may feel that there is no real life consequences of obligations, so they have no motivation to behave truthfully. And the second one is the respondent do have well-formed preference and they want to reveal it, but it kind of be habitated by this repeated framework of the discrete choice experiment. And the last one is that the respondent no irrational preference, but this is kind of beyond the scope of our paper. Yeah, so overall, our research question is that we want to understand the extent of the learning of taking real discrete choice experiment, and we want to know such effect is caused by which mechanism. Maybe it's purely from the hypothetical nature, then we will anticipate that we will observe no learning of fatigue effects at all in a real discrete choice experiment. And maybe it's purely from the repeated nature, then we can expect that we can observe such effect in both hypothetical and the real discrete choice experiment, and also consistent in terms of the magnitude. And maybe it's from the hypothetical and repeated nature jointly, then we will expect that we can observe such effect in both types of disease, but it's kind of a difference in terms of magnitude. Yeah, so to solve our research question, we have designed an experiment. And the main topic of this experiment is to understand how much people are willing to pay for the sum of the main attributes for a butterfly conservation program. And we have done a survey in Lexington target back to 2016. And since we're going to understand the real, learning the fatigue effects in real and hypothetical discrete choice experiment, so we have set two treatment groups. One is hypothetical, where respondents do not have to pay for what they have chosen. And the other one is real, where respondents have to pay for what they have chosen, but not all of the choices. Only one of them will randomly choose to be benefit the roll of dice. And we call this as match discrete choice experiment, because other than the payment role, all of the other design details are totally the same, like the attributes or the number of alternatives or the number of choices that they are required to answer are totally the same between the hypothetical and the real treatment groups. Yeah, so here are the four attributes we have in the experiment. The first one is location. And here are three cities, and you can just regard the three cities as far or in the middle near to butterfly conservation program. And the second one is the accessibility, is whether the public have the access to visit the site. And the third one is called restriction, is whether there is a certified sign indicating that this is a butterfly conservation program included. And the last one is just to show how much people are willing to pay to support donate to the butterfly conservation program. Yeah, so here are the sample choice set. So overall, we have 4 attributes. And for each choice set, we have 2 alternatives, with one being the opt-out option. And for each respondent, they have to answer 6 choices, the 6 choices in total. Yeah, so the next step is talk about the econometric strategy. So based on the random utility framework, we follow Kazatsky 2014 paper. We have explored the preference consistency and the preference stability respectively. For the preference consistency, we have run the conditional logic model for each choice set, and then we calculate the ways to pay for each attribute for each choice set, and then we plot those values to pay for each attribute over the choice set number. So it looks like a dynamic. So that's why we also call this as preference parameter dynamics. And similarly for the preference stability, we aim to calculate those relative scale parameters out, and we choose first choice set as our baseline case, and we incorporate those choice set down variables to the scale. To model such scale, we have applied heteroscedastic versions of some common discrete choice models like conditional logic, mixed logic, and generalized multinomial logic. For the mixed logic and generalized multinomial logic, we have further allowed the random parameters to be correlated or not correlated. Again, after we calculate those relative scale parameters out, we plot them over the choice numbers. So again, it looks like scale parameter dynamics. So what do we expect? For the preference consistency, if there is a learning fatigue happening, we may expect that there might be some significant difference between the choice and it may follow some patterns, but we don't know whether it's going upward or downward. But for the preference stability, we know that skill parameters equals to the inverse of the variance of everything in the utility function. So when learning happens, we know that the variance might decrease. So on the other side, the skill parameter increases. For the fatigue, similarly, the skill parameters may decrease if the fatigue happens. Yeah, so let's get to the results section. So here are the summary statistics, and we found no significant difference in terms of the age, the gender, the education, the race between the hypothetical and the real treatment groups. And here are the results for the preference consistency and the first 6 model of the 6 conditional logic model for each choice set. And these results are kind of consistent with our expectation that respondents prefer a lower price and they prefer a near location and they prefer to have the public access to the butterfly conservation program. And this is the figure that we have plotted those willing to pay for attributes over the choice number. And again, the willingness to pay for all attributes remains stable across the choice sets. So in this perspective, we kind of see that the preference is pretty consistent in this perspective. So next is the preference stability, and for the first portion of the preference parameters, this result is kind of similar to the conditional logic models, but differently we have incorporated a set of interactions. We interact the hypothetical treatment group indicator with all the attributes, and we found after we have controlled the preference heterogeneity, we found a pretty significant hypothetical bias. And the most important one, let's get to the skill parameter section, and we actually found that none of the choice set dummies are significant, and none of the choice set dummies interact hypothetical treatment group indicator are significant, meaning that actually this, and we further calculate exponential those choice set dummies to calculate those relative parameters out and plot those over the choice set number, and we found no significant changes in skill. So again, in this perspective, our preference is stable. So overall, the preference parameters and skill parameters remain consistent in our data set, meaning that we found no learning fatigue at all. And back to the mechanism, we can see that the learning fatigue may not always be the results of the hypothetical nature or the repeated nature, and the learning fatigue may not supposed to happen. And maybe we have compared our experiment design with previous literature, which has identified such learning and fatigue effects. And we found that our experiment design is kind of more concise with only like 4 attributes and binary choice sets and only 6 providing for the respondent to answer. So we are not saying that the future experiment design should be as concise as ours, but we are saying that the concise experiment should be encouraged without compromising the sample efficiency to facilitate this learning process and reduce the fatigue. And also we encourage better instruction prior to the discrete choice experiment, maybe a video, something to better instruct the respondents to understand and to motivate how to make choices in an unfamiliar environment like the discrete choice experiment, and how to define those attributes and how to define those alternatives to guide them to make better choices to reveal their true underlying preference. Yeah, so we realized that our conclusion might be research context specific. So we encourage more replications in such like match the discrete choice experiment with hypothetical and the real situations. And also we realize not all of the respondents are fast learners or easy to become fatigued. So maybe we can model such heterogeneity in the future. And also we know that other than the utility maximization framework, there is another alternative called random regression optimization. And it said that respondents make choices in order to avoid the chosen one appearing better than the non-chosen one. So similarly, we want to know, and we're kind of curious what that those learning of fatigue effects looks like under this framework of random regression. Yeah, so that's what I want to talk for today. And thank you so much for your patience. And let me know if you have any questions.
I'm trying to understand what the learning, my understanding of learning in lab experiments is that it typically what happened in repeat again, right? Where it's a strategic component and I need to learn about my the players playing this and I strategic component. So in your setup, what's the learning component? Do you change the attributes of your choice or you still ask the same?
Yeah, I think the learning here is more about learning how to make choices in an unfamiliar environment. Because imagine that you are presented and facing an unfamiliar environment, making choices for unfamiliar use. Your first couple of the choices might reveal your true and learn purpose. But after you have made a couple of the choice, and you will get better, what I really want to choose for this choices. So this is kind of a learning process where I'm not.
So you ask the same question, is the same attributes of what it says?
No, 6 but yeah, this is kind of different because the 6 choice set is different in terms of the actual values. Yeah, but they are two the same in terms of the format, like 2 or 3 different. Yeah.
And then I have, so I like learning fatigue, right? Because learning takes place, but there's no fatigue. Then we can always ask them to make more choice and throw out the initial parts and pick the parts where they mature, right? They accumulate the learning, right? Or if it's the other way around, there's no learning, but there's fatigue, and they can limit the number of choices that they need to make so that they can enter the fatigue phase, right? So I think that's an interesting question, but for conclusion is no learning.
Yeah,
no fatigue. Yeah. Cool. So that's good news, right? Somehow. Okay. All right.
Thank you so much.
So just a quick, again, clarifying question and just a general comment. So the easy, quick question is how do you, I'm just curious how you compel payment in Qualtrics? And then, but then the broader question is, so is this a true donation mechanism? And if so, donation mechanisms are preference revealing and not hypothetical or real context, right? Because in the real context, there's always the possibility of free writing. So can you comment on exactly what the choices were? Was it truly a donation? And if so, what would happen as a result of the donation? What was the good that people were buying? And is that truly preference revealing in the real case?
Oh yeah, I see your point. But actually, this survey is not done by myself, so I'm not pretty sure about like how they make payments.
I'll answer. So we did this choice experiment in the field, and everyone got $10 cash, and so the payment was like as agreeing to the survey, it's compulsory to agree to a binding trust set.
Okay, so the real one wasn't in Qualtrics?
So the survey was implemented in Qualtrics, but the survey was conducted in the field. So
Okay,
it was just
so you did it on a computer and say,
Yeah.
So okay,
Yeah.
so you didn't use Qualtrics panel for the.
That's right.
Okay.
But I will say that I have several times now, I have used Qualtrics to do compulsory payment. It takes a little bit of work to get them to agree to basically do modified payments. And then for the last part, is just to what they were purchasing. We sort of had an exclusion principle where $1 equals 1 plant donate as a way of trying to break that free riding debate.
But the concept, it's not a traditional binding thing. And
Yeah, but the idea, so it's as a way to sort of break the free riding, $1 equals 1 plant donate.
okay, so Okay.
Did your hypothetical treatment have any controls for hypothetical bias, consequential statements or cheap talk?
Yeah, I think we do have a check down.
Okay.
Yeah.
And have you thought about how to fit the regret minimization framework into the econometric model?
You mean the regret? The
Yeah.
regret minimization?
Yeah.
But I think in our data set, we cannot do that because if I remember correctly, if it is binary choice, the random regret minimization totally the same as the utility method.
It's the same.
Yeah, it's totally the same. So in our data set, I would not test that. But maybe in the future, we have a great alternative for to make this choice. We definitely will try that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
So obviously we have no results in terms of the conclusions. But what if you have another study and you got a significant results? So how do you like generalize that into like how to illustrate the external validity?
Yeah, first of all, yeah, we realize this could be a research context. So we definitely encourage more replication in the future. And also, what I want to say is that our non-defects have so many implications. Like we do encourage concise experiments because all we have now with data tells us that concise experiment, we found nothing. We found the word of our competency. That's a good thing, right? So yeah, that's yeah. So thank you for your question. Any other question? And again, thank you so much for your patience. Thanks for listening. Yeah.
Do you know where it is?
View.
View. Full screen.
Yes.
Great.
Okay, so for the benefit of those online audience, I will be just standing behind the podium. So my name is Yilan Xi. I'm an associate professor from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. This is the work that I'm working with my graduate student, Sebastian Box-Kuya, who is also in the audience. So he will take the hard questions from you guys. The topic is about social learning about climate change risk. So I'm shifting the gears from lab experiments to an empirical study. What motivates our study is that we want to understand what's informing people's climate change risk perception. This is important because forming the up-to-date risk perception is important for people to, inform their adaptation and mitigation behaviors and also facilitate collective action so that we can increase the world's climate resilience. Then there is a question of how do people update their climate risk perception? And there's abundant literature showing that people learn from personal experiences of natural disasters. So typically after experience a disaster, the local region will see an increase in flood insurance take-up rates and a decrease in housing prices. But this kind of learning is very slow, right? Because natural disasters do not happen every day to every single person. So our question here is whether we can expedite this learning process by, learning from our peers' experience of natural disasters. If that is the case, then that would make the adaptation much more faster. And this study is built upon a huge literature of social finance and social learning literature. So the idea of social finance is that people learn from their peers' financial behaviors so that they can understand how to make their own financial decisions. And the social learning literature is largely built upon how people learn about the quality of certain products or technology when they observe their friends using the technology or the product. A lot of this literature is using the peer effect identification, basically, observing my peers using certain product increase my probability of using the same product. But then there's challenges to the peer effect identification, as those people are familiar with the literature would probably know, because of the so-called exogenous peer effects, in the sense that people are making similar decisions. Peers are making similar decisions, not because they learn anything from each other, but because they have similar social demographic characteristics that's making them making similar decisions. So there are several strategies that can be used, either using instrumental variables or using random peer group assignment. And then the last solution here, which is also what we use in our study, is the random peer treatment. So the idea is to select a certain group of peers to receive certain treatment, like promotion for a new technology, and then we want to see whether other people would also adopt the same technology. And of course, then in our situation, the treatment is a random treatment brought by the nature, which is natural disaster. In our particular case, it's the hurricane. So in this paper, we investigate the flood insurance taken nationwide after hurricanes Harvey and Irma, which happened to come head in head in about 10 days apart. So in this case, we want to account for social learning effects. So we aggregate our outcome variables to the county month level as the count of number of flood insurance policies in force in that particular month in that particular county. In order to measure the network between the counties, we use the famous Facebook ACI Social Connectiveness Index. I want to point out that in the existing literature, people use this index as an interaction term. Basically, try to see what happening in peers' place would affect my outcome, as the interaction term between peers' treatment and my own treatment. In our situation, we actually put this in a social network framework, trying to create a social network adjacency matrix so that we can interpret this in the framework that's more in line with the peer effect literature, that is the spillover from the peers. So we estimate a network difference in differences model, which is an extension of the existing spatial difference in differences model, where we just replace the spatial weighting matrix with the social network adjacency matrix. So then under this framework, we will be able to identify both the direct treatment effects on the affected areas, that is those counties that had a disaster declaration because of these two hurricanes. We can also simultaneously estimate the spillover effects on those counties that are not directly affected by the two hurricanes. Just to give you some idea what has been done in the literature about the Facebook network, it has been shown that the social network, as more, measured by the social connectedness index, is facilitating all kinds of economic behaviors in the economy. Especially, I want to point out two studies that look at what's going on during the COVID time. Again, they are using this index as an interaction term. So they are showing that in places or among individuals who have stronger Facebook connections to regions that experience an outbreak during the pandemic, they are more likely to restrict their mobility. Okay, so that's also motivating our study. So now I'm going to present to you this network difference in difference model, where the YIT is the outcome variable we want to measure for the county. We actually take the log of the counts of number of policies in force plus a tiny number, because some county in some months will have 0 flood insurance in force, depending on where they are. And then this DIT is a treatment dummy that is value of 1 if this county I is already experienced the 2 hurricanes at time T. And then this DJT is a dummy variable in a similar fashion that indicates whether a peer J county is already post-treatment or not. And this WIJ is, is a weight that we put on this treatment dummy for the peers, depending on the SCI. And this is weighted such that it's relative to all the inference received by county I. Okay, and then we have some fixed effects in there, and the standard errors are clustered at the county level. Under this framework, alpha will measure the average direct treatment effects on the treated, that is the counties that had a disaster declaration because of these two counties. And then beta, weighted by the peer average peer treatment, which is the WDT term, will then indicate the average indirect treatment effect, which is the so-called spillover effect or social learning effect from peers treatment. And then for a county that's in the treated area that experience both the direct effect and the indirect effect, some people might say, why would they learn? Because they are part of the social network, so they would also learn. And then for the unaffected county, they only experience the indirect effect, which is apparent. And then we use the National Flood Insurance Program policy data, which is policy level data, and we do our aggregation. We also count the number of active policies, total policies, total policies and a number of policies inside and outside of the special flood hazard area, SFHAs, and then inside the flood zones. I call them flood zones for sure. We also distinguish whether a policy is a new policy that's newly become effective in that month, or it's a renewed policy that's that exists and got renewed in that month. Okay, so this would tell us sort of the intensive margin versus the extensive margin distinction. We also include the Yale climate opinion map, where they measure the percentage of population in a county believing global warming is happening as an outcome variable, so that we can show you that the change in people's flood insurance take-up behavior is consistent with their updated belief about global warming, which is the older term for climate change. And then we use the SCI from Facebook. There are some other controls I don't want to go through. Just to give you some idea about the timeline. Hurricane Harvey made a landfall on August 25th, 2017. Irma made a landfall in about 2 weeks later. So we define the control periods, keeping in mind our number of, our analysis happened at the county month level. So anything after, well, anything between September 2016 to August of 2017, that's 1 year before the landfall, is considered as a control period, and then anything after September 27 to 2 years, or this is 3 years after, then will be as the treatment period. We define 97 counties in Texas, Florida, and Georgia, where they have a disaster declaration as a treated area, and the rest counties in the country as the control area. And this is a map showing the average SCI to the treated area, where the treated areas are bolded with their borders. You see, coastal areas definitely have stronger connection to the treated areas, but there are also strong connections from California and then the New England area. And just to show you the estimation results, here we have 4 columns of outcomes. The total number of policy enforced in the first column and renewals, and then new policies, and last column is their belief about climate change happening. Here, I want you to pay attention to this variable here, which is the peer hurricane. So peer hurricane is having a positive and significant coefficient, which indicates that there's social learning take place. So if you want to interpret this coefficient of 0.43 for the total number of policy enforced, for example, that means that in the counterfactual world, where I'm the only one in the system that's not experiencing any hurricane, all my peers are experiencing hurricane, then the number of policies in my region will increase by 43%. And then of course, in the real world, it's not the case that 100% of all my peers experience a hurricane. So we also need to weight that by the percentage of peers getting treated. So that gets to the average treatment, if the average indirect effect on the treated, which is about 20%. For the untreated area weighted by the much smaller share of peers being treated, so the increase is about 2%. That's how you also interpret other columns of this table. And then if we want to visualize the percentage increase on the map, you see a pattern that's very similar to the ACI, but with California having a lighter color. But here, the takeaway message is that it's not just these areas that are very close to the treatment areas that's experiencing a spillover effect or social learning effect. It's also those far away area in New England that's learning from this event. And then we do a whole bunch of robustness check, trying to understand whether this is whether the kind of social learning effect we observe is driven by anything that's, in the fashion of the exogenous peer effects, right? For example, is it because they are very closer to the treated area so that they learn, or not, right? So here we try to split the untreated area into those that are adjacent to the treated county and those that are not adjacent to the treated county. We actually see, they are not statistically different. As a matter of fact, the effect for the counties that are closer to the treated counties are less precisely estimated. We also split the untreated into coastal counties and non-coastal counties. It happened that actually non-coastal counties spillover effect are more precisely estimated, and the two are not statistically different. We also, split the sample into the counties in the 3 states that experienced 2 hurricanes versus those not, and again, they are not statistically different. We also group them by whether those counties are in the same media market with the affected counties or not. Again, they are not statistically different. And then we also split the untreated into the counties in the states on the hurricane path or not. And again, there's no statistical difference in the spillover effects. Okay. And then we also try to split our counts of policies into, the policies within the flood zones and then outside of the flood zones. And we see actually learning mostly happened for those outside flood zones. Okay, they are, more systematically positive and significant. And we interpret this as the new news effect, because those that are already in the flood zone, they know very well about the risk because they are in the flood zone. But then for those outside of flood zone, the homeowners outside of flood zone, they are less aware of the risk. Therefore, something happening to their peers quickly remind them that this could have been something that happened to themselves. So they learn from peers' experience more. And then we also try to, split our untreated into whether they are high risk or low risk in terms of flood risk, whether they have high belief or low belief, whether they have high education or low education, or high value to income ratio or low high to income ratio. Again, we don't see statistically different treatment spillover effects. Here that says there's no heterogeneity along those dimensions. So that tells us maybe the exogenous peer effect is not playing a role. It's not at least driving the results here. And then because we see a huge, much larger learning, much more salient learning effects happening for those homeowners outside of flood zone, then you might wonder, maybe that's overreaction. Maybe people just, panic and they should not have buy the insurance because their risk is so small. So here we try to use the ex post utilization of the insurance to make a case that they are actually utilizing the insurance that they buy. So here we are comparing the spillover effects on the number of policies versus the spillover effect on the number of claims. You can find that the percentage increase in the number of claims is larger than the percentage of increase in the number of policies, indicating a much higher utilization rate. In the untreated areas because of learning, social learning effects. So that's sort of good news. Yes, okay, so I'm right on the track, coming to the conclusion. So our work highlights the role of social interaction and social net structure in influencing people's risk perception and their adaptation. And then I didn't emphasize this, but we did not find a direct treatment effects. Actually, what has been identified in the literature as the direct treatment effect could well be the case that they are learning from their social peers, and they have so many social peers in their region that experience the disaster that's making them learn more effectively. And then here I also lay out a few implications for policy implications. Very importantly, I want to emphasize that if social network is playing a role in social learning, then that can tell us where is the ideal injection point for social intervention to nudge people to take actions for climate change. Thank you very much. I can take some questions. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. One basic question, what is the definition of peer?
Peer. Okay, so because our analysis is aggregated to the county and month level, so we are identifying the peer counties. So if you look at this map here, okay, so each unit is a county, and the part just indicates how connected they are to the treated area on average, because there are many counties in the treated area and they have connection and ACI to each county, and we just weight them. So that's our definition of peer, is not at the individual level. Yes.
I'm wondering a little bit about the cumulative nature of learning here. In a couple of hurricanes, of course there's hurricanes every year, and some are big and some are small, and there are also other flooding events that occur that are not necessarily related to hurricane. And so I'm just wondering if there are placebo multiplication tests you can run here, or if you have run, and also how to think about those other flooding events that are maybe not quite
as large.
Harvey or what have you.
Right. Right. So this is an interesting period. If you look at the hurricane history, the most previous major hurricane before Hurricane Harvey is Hurricane Sandy, which happened in 2012. And in between is a quite how do I put this, quiet period in terms of flooding. If you check the flood damage during this period, is not as significant. So that is why we pick this particular event in this period. There could be some regional flood going on. But I would think, as a matter of fact, people might be more interested in the, external validity of this finding here, because Hurricane Harvey is such a dramatic, hurricane that flooded the entire Houston area and brought the national attention to it, right? So we would expect smaller regional effects will have smaller learning effects, but we definitely need an entire panel of floods to test that hypothesis, which is what we plan to do. Thank you. Yes.
Along those same lines, your factor about what percent of the population believe global warming is happening. Do you distinguish between geologic versus anthropogenic cause global warming?
No, there's no such distinction in the survey. In the survey, it's as simple as, do you believe global warming is happening, yes or no? And they do their trick to weight this to be representative at the county level. Yeah, so we definitely don't know behind the scene what's in their mind. It's just that we use our econometric model, to estimate this direct effect and the spillover effect, and then we conclude that the spillover effect is consistent with the spillover effect that we found in the behavior part. And this is actually a big part in the social learning literature, is that we cannot simply believe what they have. We also need to get into their mind and see whether they change their belief or not. It should not be the case that they are simply mimicking what their friends are doing, but not understanding what's going on. Then that's not learning. It must be the case that I observe my friend is using an iPhone, and that informs me that iPhone is a good product, and therefore I want to buy it. It cannot be the case that, I just simply want to do the same thing as my friend. And that's a huge distinction in the social learning literature, and that is why we want to check their belief about climate change. Any other questions? Yes.
So according to your map showing up there, is happening. There's overlap of the social connectedness with the larger urban area. So
that's true.
Naturally, there are like larger population out there.
Right.
So as I understand, according to the literature of social learning, the key factor is how to define the connectedness or the adjacency.
Right.
So do they really interact with each other or potentially?
Right. So we do a gravity model to understand what's in ACI, and actually we find that distance is a huge predictor of ACI. If we don't control for distance, then we will see that ACI is correlated with some social economic factors like income, education. But once we control for the distance, then everything others are gone. That I understand that does not fully answer your question. But we also do the heterogeneity analysis that split our untreated by their demographics, and we do not find any differences in the skill.
I guess it's natural or natural to have friends in those urban areas.
Yes.
There's big population.
Right. Yeah. And what we don't want is that what's driving them to buy insurance is not their social connection, but because they are richer. That kind of story, right? But then we split the sample by income, and we did not find any difference between high and low income counties in the untreated. Thank you. I will be happy to have more questions.
Do you want to do it? It's not showing up here.
Okay. Is it- let's see if I can- Is it? Oh, there you go.
There you go.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Giulio Farolfi. I'm a PhD student at Clark University, and today I will be presenting this joint work with Professor Robert Johnston. And it's focusing on preferences for programs aimed at expanding bivalve shellfish aquaculture. As many of you may already know, bivalve shellfish aquaculture is the activity of growing and harvesting species such as clams, oysters, and scallops, and it's usually promoted as a more sustainable alternative to wild capture shell fisheries. This is because it tends to be more productive and provide ecosystem services in the proximity of the growing area. However, expanding these type of activities involves many trade-offs. These trade-offs are mostly related to the type of gear that is used to grow shellfish. There's been a lot of interest from policymakers to expand these type of activities because it tends to be more productive, it provides ecosystem services. However, it's kind of a hot topic right now, especially in southern New England, because in some instances there's been coverage from popular media emphasizing opposition towards these type of expansions. However, there's no evidence in the economic literature, well, there's no estimates in the economic literature for these type of preferences. As I mentioned before, the type of trade-offs that expanding these type of activities involve are related to the type of gear that is used. And we can make a basic distinction, a main distinction between the two types of gear. One is floating gear, which tends to be more productive. It tends to be more visible, and also it tends to prevent accessibility to the growing area compared to the other alternative, which is on bottom gear. Which uses gear that is anchored at the bottom of the water body. And so it's usually less visible. It's also less productive. And in some cases, it can allow access to the growing area, for example, for navigation. This slide just shows you a few pictures of different growing areas of floating gear versus on bottom gear, to give you an idea of how they can look like. And as I mentioned before, there's no evidence there's no evidence in the economics literature about preferences for specifically bivalve shellfish aquaculture. Most of the work that has been done was done on finfish or shrimp aquaculture that involve completely different trade-offs compared to bivalve. There's been some work done in the non-economic literature, but most of these studies provide mostly qualitative results and not estimates of welfare theoretical preferences for this type of program. And so the aim of this paper is to fill this gap in the literature by answering questions such as, are preferences for expansion programs for bivalve shellfish for positive, negative, why are they positive, why are they negative, and whether the sort of narrative that we see in the popular media opposing sort of these type of programs is actually reflecting preferences for these type of programs. In order to estimate these preferences, we develop a discrete choice experiment, and we apply it to a case study in Connecticut. We include 5 non-cost attributes in our DC and 1 cost attribute. Our model is based on a standard random utility model in which we allow for interactions between a discrete non-cost attribute that basically defines where the geographical location of where the expansion program will happen, and other non-cost attributes that are hypothesized to, well, the preferences for these other non-cost attributes are hypothesized to vary depending on the location. It took us more than 2 years to develop the discrete choice experiment and in general the survey instrument. We just wanted to make sure that we included the correct attributes in the DC. Also, we wanted to make sure that all the information contained in the survey instrument was interpreted consistently by respondents. And also that the information that was in the survey instrument was allowing respondents to make informed decisions when answering DC questions. In order to do that, we ran 6 different focus groups. And we also had many meetings with stakeholders, policymakers, and shellfish aquaculture experts across different New England states. So we convey information in the survey instrument through different channels, text, of course, but we also include graphics, GIS maps in order to sort of explain all the possible trade-offs that are involved in this decision. And in this table, we included the description of our 5 non-cost attributes and our cost attributes that we include in our DCE questions. So the first 4 of these non-cost attributes are continuous, and these are the first 4, and they are the amount of the increase in acreage using floating gear provided by the program, the increase in acreage using on-bottom gear, the increase in the number of jobs and production in the shellfish aquaculture industry provided by the program, and the increase in water clarity in the proximity of the growing area. We also have the location attribute that I mentioned before, and the levels for these. We have 5 levels for these attributes, and they are the 4 coastal counties in Connecticut, plus the omitted default in our model, which is on a level that does not specify a specific location along the coastline. So in this case, the program could be implemented anywhere along the Connecticut coastline. And then we have our cost attribute, which is expressed in terms of additional annual fees and taxes faced by each household. So this is an example of the one of the DC questions that we have in our experimental design. In order to develop these questions, we followed the guidelines in the DC literature. We use visible choice sets. Each respondent answered 4 of these questions while taking the survey, and where the current situation is always the same, is always identical across all the questions, but the proposed programs are different. So we implemented the survey in January and February of 2022. The sampling was conducted by an external research firm, basically randomly extracting households from an online panel of Connecticut households. And given the sort of concerns that are usually related to the use of online panels, we included in the survey several screening questions that would allow us to exclude possible low quality responses. We end up excluding some of these responses in the model that we included in this presentation, but our results are robust to these exclusions. So our model is a standard random parameter mixed logit model estimated in willingness to pay space. So all the parameters can be interpreted directly as well for measures. In order to ensure convergence of the model, we do not estimate the alternative specific constant that we include in the model in willingness to pay space. So that, and the alternative specific constant that we include is the one corresponding to the status quo or the current situation. All the other parameters are estimated in willingness to pay space. Also, to ensure the convergence of the model, the interaction terms that I mentioned before, the parameters relative to these interaction terms are assumed to be fixed and non-random. The distributions of random parameters are normal distributions for all the non-cost parameters, and we assume a log normal distribution for the cost parameter. So in this table, we include the estimates for the random parameters in our model. And there are many conclusions that can be drawn from this table. I would like to focus on 4. The first one is that if we look at the estimated standard deviation for the distribution of these parameters, they are all significant, and their magnitude suggests that there is like there is significant heterogeneity in preferences for these type of expansion programs. Second, we see that preferences for our continuous non-cost attributes tend to be positive, also for floating gear, which is not significant. And this is very important because it essentially tells us that the representative household does not really care too much about visibility of gear when making decision whether to support expansion programs or not. Also, we see that location matters, especially we can see that preferences tend to be comparatively lower if the expansion program takes place in location 1, which is Fairfield County, and preferences are comparatively higher if the expansion program would happen in location 2, which is New Haven County. So location matters, but not just by itself. It also, in some instances, influences preferences for other non-cost attributes, as we can see from this table, where we report no random parameters estimate in our model, which are basically the interaction terms that I mentioned before. And these are interaction terms between the floating gear attribute and location, and the water clarity attributes and location. And we can see that comparatively speaking, a 1% increase in floating gear is more valued if it happens in location 1, for example, which is again Fairfield County, and the same happens for water clarity. Whether comparatively an increase in water clarity in location 2 is valued less. So this is basically just a summary of what I just said. All the coefficients can be, since all the coefficients can be interpreted directly as welfare measures, we have that basically 1% increase on bottom gear acreage is valued like $1.56 by the representative consumers, and all the other non-cost attributes can be interpreted in the same way. Also, we find no reason to believe that visibility of gear affects preferences of individuals. And also we see that location matters. And since location matters, this means that we cannot use one size fits all type of rule of thumb if we want to optimize total willingness to pay in different locations along the Connecticut coastline. In order to show how the patterns of preferences change across location, we compute total willingness to pay of using a linear function of our attributes, and we compute standard errors using the delta method, and then look at the ordinal preference rank for different alternatives in our experimental design, and we calculate this total willingness to pay for all the possible locations. And the results are shown in this table, where we take basically 3 different programs from our experimental design. We compute total willingness to pay, and for each one possible location that we have in our DC. So the first thing to notice is that total willingness to pay tends to be positive for all of them, and significantly positive. And this is true for these 3 alternatives, but we ran similar. We basically computed the same thing for all the other alternatives in our experimental design, and we observed the same results. Also, we see that an important conclusion is that depending on what is proposed, which program is proposed, the optimal location changes. So for example, alternative 1, if alternative 1 or program 1 is proposed, the optimal location in terms of total willingness to pay would be New London County. However, for alternative 2, this would be New Haven. Also, it's important to look at what of course, there are some programs that, given our results tend to be preferred to others. For example, alternative 2 tends to be preferred to alternative 3 in most cases, except for Fairfield County, in which alternative 3 is actually preferred to alternative 2. And so in conclusion, we see that we have basically the preferences for expansion programs of bivalve shellfish aquaculture tend to be positive for a representative consumer, despite the significant heterogeneity that we observe in our results. And also we see that location matters. Location is important. Is not we cannot use the same rule in order to optimize total willingness to pay for each one of the coastal location that we include in our model, but we need to take that into account if we want to apply the best possible program for each one of the coastal counties that we consider. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions or comments, they're welcome. Yes.
I have a hard time understanding why households would pay for expanding aquaculture. Isn't a profitable endeavor? When private companies just invest in aquaculture, why are households paying?
Well, because there are many ways to promote like aquaculture in the sense that there's a lot that public money can be used to promote aquaculture. For example, usually these type of activities they need a permit to open to start their business. And so, for example, we can like their policymakers could make it easier to provide these type of permits and expedite the process, or for example have programs that teach people that are interested in starting an aquaculture business how to obtain this permit and so on and so forth. So there are basically this is actually something that this was a question that we got a lot during the focus groups. And we actually addressed it. We spent a lot of time explaining in the survey instrument why people would pay for this type of programs, in the sense how this tax money would be spent in order to promote aquaculture. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Can you speak a little bit that, since you did these focus groups, how people use that clarity measure? The magnitude is quite large.
Yes.
You got the sense that, especially if it's a floating structure, that I'm never going to get close enough to it to see this clear water.
Yeah.
So are people assuming it's going to have a larger scale impact on clarity?
Actually, yeah, that's a great question. We at the beginning, yes, I think during the focus groups, people might have the impression that the scale of the impact was greater than it would be, but that's why we emphasized a lot in the survey instrument. We emphasized multiple instances that the effect would be happening only in the proximity of the growing area, and despite that we still get very high preferences for that water clarity impact. So I think it's more it's the type of preferences that we're capturing. They're more like a type of a non-use value type of preference rather than a use value. So they don't care if they can observe the water clarity impact, but they care that the water quality, the water clarity is higher in that area. Yeah. Thank you. Right. Thank you very much.
Okay, last talk here, I'm going to talk about adaptation on the coastline. And again, using a choice experiment, and it was added at the last minute to a survey that Steven Cyphers was doing. And I just thought, let's ask people about rebuilding or buyouts and see how they respond. And I didn't realize how complicated the econometric model was going to be when I wrote the question at the time. So still a lot of work in progress. I'll give you a little motivation real quick. Coastal risk is a major issue. The costs are staggering, and it looks like they're getting worse over time. So how do we deal with that? There's clearly interest in actively managing the risks on the coast via seawalls and beach nourishment. But it's pretty clear that organized retreat is going to be a part of the strategy at some point. So that's the major motivation here is to try to explore preferences for rebuilding versus retreating. And the setting here is Alabama and Florida. So it's Mobile Bay, Alabama, and Pensacola Bay, Florida. So we're interested in rebuilding versus accepting a buyout. We're also interested in the idea of coordination, because we don't want checkerboarding in buyouts, because you still have to provide utilities if there's someone who lives there. So if we're going to buy out an area, we need to buy out the whole area. So we're interested in the coordination problem, and the main motivation for the research is, what is the willingness to pay for mitigation? What are people willing to accept for buyouts? We're also going to look at alternative uses of coastal land, where one of the scenarios would be it's purchased by a redeveloper, and another scenario, the buyout would be made by a nature preserve. So your land would then be converted to a nature preserve. And then there's the issue of coordination, which I don't have results for yet, but I'll show you what I'm working on. So there's a close-up of the study site. So it's mostly people who live near the water in these bays. Okay response rate. You can kind of see what the sample looks like. One of the issues that we're really interested in is connection to place. If you grew up there, if you plan to reside there for a long time. So we have questions about plans to move away or stay. We have questions about I think it's the importance of friendships in the area, which you think would be a connection to place as well. Okay, so here's the scenario to jumping right in. Imagine a major storm struck your community and your home suffered significant damage such that it's a total loss. So here's your options. You can rebuild as was. It's going to be some out-of-pocket cost. You're going to have the same risk that you had previously. You can upgrade, and it's going to cost more, and we're going to assign a lower risk, or you can accept a buyout from one of two entities and move somewhere else. And then we had two of these choice sets for each person. The design that we came up with is pretty much like a pivot design. So we're going to baseline them on their perceived risk perceptions, and their housing value and their land value. So in order to measure risk perceptions, this is an instrument I've been using in survey work for a while. In order to get kind of a relative frequency assessment, tell them that, present this to them and ask how many homes like theirs do they think would suffer significant damage over the next 50 years. And that gives us kind of a way to get, what's the relative likelihood. So that's the baseline risk measure. There's the data for the risk measures. You can see some people are quite certain that everybody's going to flood, and some people think nobody's going to flood. And there's a big spike at 50%, so a coin flip. So here's a little bit more detail on the scenarios. We know their structure value, and we know their total property value. So we're gonna and we take these percentages and apply them to their property value. So they actually just see the number. They don't see the percentage. They see just a number. We do, to round out the scenario, we tell them that there's low interest loans available to help finance, so they don't have to worry about out-of-pocket costs. So those are the first two options. The last two differ in the nature of the entity that does the buyout. So in option 3, there's a nature preserve that's open to the public, and buyouts, we just set it at a range that we thought was reasonable. And then there's a residual risk with these choices that I struggled with how to treat. We did ask them where they would move afterwards. So I kind of like benchmarked their risk in their new location from their baseline risk, which is not the best thing to do, but it's the best thing I could come up with. Okay, the experimental part here is that we introduced social pressures. So half of them got one of these treatments, where they're told that the majority of people were going to rebuild as was, we're going to upgrade, or we're going to accept a buyout. So we're interested to see, even if a hypothetical setting, if these kinds of prompts will get them to be more likely to do one of these three things. The raw data here, you can see rebuilding with an upgrade was the most preferred choice. The developer buyout was the least preferred choice, which is not surprising. I think a lot of people don't like the idea of someone's going to buy me out and then just redevelop the land. So the choice model here, which is, I've been wading into this for quite a while. So because we're dealing with housing consumption, I have a long time horizon. So, if I rebuild, I'm going to be exposed to this risk, over, the next 20 or 30 years that I live at the house. So I'm having to deal with long time horizons, discrete choice formulation. So I've got household location specific housing services. That's the alpha parameter. I've got a quadratic risk, which again is based on their perceptions and then tweaking their perceptions. And then I've got expected consumption over the time horizon of occupying that house. So I've got your income minus your housing payment, and I'm trying to get a present value for that. So that's what that first thing is. And then I've got costs for rebuilding, and I've got payments for buyouts. And you'll notice here the marginal utilities of income are not the same across the two, because this is not a marginal change. This is a discrete change. That causes a lot of trouble when it comes to post-estimation welfare analysis. But it makes sense. And the data looks good. So the model output looks good, but post-estimation, all the welfare analysis is, I'm back reading Hahnemann's 1981 paper to try to figure out how to do the welfare analysis. Is that all clear? Cool. All right, so the basic RUM setup that I think you're probably all familiar with. I decided to use the generalized multinomial logit, which seems to work pretty well. That's the background on the model. It's simulated simulated maximum likelihood. So here's the results. So we do a grid search for the gamma parameter, which mixes the two different types of heterogeneity. So we get a 0.7 for that. Upgrade utility. So this is the housing specific, location specific housing utility. Upgrade is positive. So people like the idea of upgrading. The buyout utilities are both negative, but the developer is the more negative. So people do not like that. Risk is negative and concave, which is pretty cool. It seems to fit well. And what's really critical here is these marginal utilities of income vary across scenarios. So you can see the cost scenario and the pay scenario. Those are an order of magnitude different in the marginal utilities of income. And there's also an exponential model where I get similar results there. The buyout treatment is statistically significant. So when we tell people the social pressure for buyout, when we tell people imagine that the majority are going to have said they're going to accept the buyout, that does increase the likelihood of accepting a buyout, in a hypothetical choice experiment. Upgrade and rebuild as was have no influence, which is kind of not surprising. I think the coordination really comes from the buyout option. There's a graphic of the utilities, the distribution of the utilities. So those are the only random parameters in the model, are just the utilities. Everything else is fixed. What else? Okay, so for scale heterogeneity, people that said friendships were important in the area and those with higher incomes, that seems to influence the scale parameter in the model. The tau parameter is not particularly informative. So using information criteria, it looks like the exponential willingness to pay is the best model, but I'll still stick with both of them going forward to discuss results. So initial estimates of marginal willingness to pay. So if we do that calculation from the choice model, we're going to get, there's a couple of things that vary here. What's the discount rate? So I use 2% and 4% in order to estimate willingness to pay. So this would be annual willingness to pay. And the marginal utility of income varies across the two scenarios. So they're going to be different depending upon whether you're talking about risk for a rebuild or risk for a buyout where you move somewhere else. So you can see reasonable looking estimates, I guess. I don't know, I've seen a lot of these before, but I think useful from a welfare standpoint in terms of what are people willing to pay to reduce risk. So for assessment of mitigation measures and so forth, these could be useful. The treatment effects here, which I haven't estimated yet, that was just going to be the difference in the likelihood of choosing the buyout with social pressure turned on or off. So that's to be done. In order to do this, though, I have to estimate total willingness to pay, which is what I am working on right now. So I can show you some results. So if we're dealing with total willingness to pay, we have to start with thinking about what the maximum utility is from a choice set, and then take away an option, and then figure out what's the compensating variation for that. But because we have these different marginal utility of incomes, it doesn't simplify like the standard model does. So I'm stuck with the expected consumption in those models, and I can't sweep out the marginal utility of income. So essentially, there's no closed form solution for willingness to pay. All right, so what do? So going back to Hahnemann's paper from 81, one of the suggestions he said was just use a linear approximation. And if I do that, so this is the implicit definition for willingness to pay for option H. And there's no closed form solution, but if we use that approximation, it'll be reasonably good for utilities that are in the range of -1 to 1. But if they're way away from that, it's going to be way off. And that implies that I can do this for the rebuilds, but not for the buyouts. And the real motivation for here is to estimate the willingness to accept a buyout. So I haven't figured out how to do it yet, but I do have willingness to pay for rebuilds. And you can see the numbers that I'm getting. I think the most interesting one would be the rebuild and reduced risk. So about $134,000. And what's the actual change in risk? On average, it's going from a 35% chance of major damage in the next 50 years to an 11% chance. So I think that's fairly informative and interesting. Those correspond to a fraction of the perceived structure value, which is, I guess, seems reasonable. And then, so what I was doing yesterday was trying to estimate a root finding algorithm to get this willingness to pay, and I haven't got good results yet. So that's the best I could come up with at this point. If anybody has suggestions, I'd love to hear. But it's complicated, as you can tell. Like, I can show you notes if you want to go through it. I could try to explain what the issues are. So I don't have much to say about conclusions here, but hopefully I'll have some estimates on willingness to accept at some point. And I totally flew through that, so we have plenty of time if there's questions or comments for me or for anybody else who already presented. Yes, please.
I apologize if I missed it, but for those social effects of my neighbors, did you look at buyouts for redevelopment versus the nature preserve? I think personally, the way I would go is
Yeah. I wish I would have done that. I didn't. It was just the buyout. Yeah, but I think we should have done that. I couldn't remember what I did, and I had to ask Steve, and I was like, what were the treatments for this? And he said, yeah. I'm like, oh, why did we do that? Yeah, it would have been better. Yeah, because I think your neighbors accepting my guess would be the nature preserve is more preferred, and there's probably even better spillover effects. If people think that the neighbors are going to do that, it would even increase the likelihood of that scenario, I think. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, just personally, like, so what bias do occur? Is this like a normal complex? What's the process like when you just developer come to your house and say, hey, or is it the government come to your house and say, hey, we want a location?
It depends who's doing it, but my understanding is it's pretty messy. If it's the federal government, like after Sandy, and if anybody else knows more about this, you can chime in. I think they would meet with the community and talk about it, and there's usually an application process, and there's research on even in the equity of the buyout process, and like, is it just poor people that are getting bought out or whatever? So I would say it's messy. It takes a long time, and yeah, we're just kind of like breezing over that stuff and just asking how people feel about the options. Yeah, Rob.
I'm struggling with the kind of with the knife edge to pay willingness to accept for yourself, where I was just working through the linear part and I didn't get to the exponential part. But at least in the linear model, right, just moving from, at least technically speaking, although you're dealing with large payments, once you move from a $1 payment to a $1 loss, right, that boom, I mean, those marginal values are striking different. Does that carry over to the exponential payment? And how do you parse that, right? Because, I mean, if you take that literally, it means that $1, what is it, $1 gain is worth 5 times less than $1 lost, at least in a linear model. Right?
Yeah.
I didn't, do the exponential in my head, but I'm just.
Right.
So I'm just wondering how I mean, that, what does that tell us about what trade-offs people are really making there? Is it really the money, or is it some, I don't know, it's trying to, that's just such a stark difference.
Yeah, and the magnitude is about the same in the exponential space. I don't know. That's a really deep question. I don't really have a good answer to it. So it makes sense to me that they would be very different across the scenarios. Yeah, why? And what is it?
So what were the magnitudes of these in the people we're talking about? We're talking about hundreds of thousands
Yeah.
of dollars.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering,
Well, the magnitudes were very different in the rebuilds tend to be cheaper than the buyouts, right? So that's one explanation, because the magnitudes are quite different. Because a rebuild, I guess the maximum was 25% of your structure value. So if it's $200,000 house, we're looking at 50 grand, but the buyouts were 70 to 110% of the entire property value. So the magnitudes were quite different. That seems to help understand why they would be so different.
I'm just wondering, I mean, because it maybe doesn't even make sense to look at it
On the margin, because the data's not there, right?
Things, and so linear, I mean, so a linear release would pay in a sense, it almost, those kind of close to the margin numbers might not.
Right.
Very much wrong.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's thought provoking. I appreciate the question. Well, other questions? Yeah.
Did you look at any heterogeneity across like erosion risk or distance to waterways? Because I'm thinking my land is eroding away by building strips of the house, probably very different.
Yeah.
From 3 blocks.
Yeah.
I would probably have my lifetime.
Yeah. That's a great point. I don't know if I have distance to the shoreline. Because there's a Qualtrics survey. I don't think we know exactly what their location is. So I think they were selected, the selection criteria was proximity, but I'll check to see if we do know that, because that should be in if we do, but I don't think we do. Unfortunately. All right. Yeah, okay, it's 11:30, so I think we're done. Thanks for hanging out, and it was a good session.
Ponder through all that, all the welfare analysis.
I'm happy to share it with you if you want to discuss it. It's terrifying. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I was even running some of the root finding stuff and I was getting numbers that didn't make sense. And it's like, oh shit.
It's one of those things where, I mean, I have a case like that where you design something in the survey, and you're like, oh, this is really cool.
Yeah.
We'll figure out the econometrics and the welfare stuff
Figure it
later.
out.
And then you get to the end, like,
Yeah, this is really hard.
really hard.
This is why people don't do this.
Right, exactly,
Right.
exactly.
But I'm glad we did it, because I think it's set up right.
Yeah, no, I wish I had more time to kind of, some of those things where I had to try to, like,
Yeah.
in my head, I'm like, yeah, I'm not really gonna achieve this.
Right. I'm the only one with kind of information on this, because Andy is retired. Right. Steve is in college. So
Yeah, I could use a co-op. Right. It looks like a fascinating.
yeah. Right.